Do you remember the sound a screen door made when it slapped shut behind you on a summer morning? That particular crack and rattle, wood frame, rusted spring, maybe a little torn at the corner where somebody's elbow had pushed through it one too many times. I want you to hold that sound in your mind right now, because where I'm taking you today, that sound is the doorbell. That sound is the welcome. That sound means you have arrived somewhere that mattered, somewhere that is gone now, and somewhere that deserves to be spoken about slowly and out loud before the last of us who remember it are gone too. I'm talking about the streets of our people, the Black-owned streets, the ones that don't appear on any historic register, that don't have a plaque on the corner, that don't get mentioned in the travel guides. I'm talking about Mr. Henderson's grocery on the corner of a block that doesn't look anything like it used to. I'm talking about Miss Odessa's beauty supply before there was such a thing as a beauty supply chain. I'm talking about the fish market that smelled like the Gulf of Mexico and sawdust and old newspaper all at once, and the man behind the counter who knew your grandmother's name without being told. Let me take you back. Not to some perfect golden time. I want to be honest with you, as I always am, because it was not perfect. There was hardship woven into every single one of those blocks, but there was something else woven in too. And I think that is what we lost when we lost those streets, and I think that is exactly what we need to talk about today. Let me start at the beginning. I want to tell you about a specific kind of store first, because if you grew up where I grew up, you know exactly what I'm describing the moment I say it. It was not a supermarket, it was not a bodega, it was not a convenience store, it was a neighborhood store, and there is a difference, and the difference is everything. The neighborhood store was usually one room, sometimes two. If the owner had ambition and a brother-in-law who knew some carpentry, the floor was wood, sometimes linoleum over wood, and it creaked in the same spot every single time. You knew where that spot was. Every child on the block knew where that spot was. The ceiling had one fan or two, and in the summer those fans did not cool anything. They just moved the heat around politely. The shelves were not uniform. Nothing was at eye level by design. Things were where they were because that is where they fit. And you learned the store the way you learned somebody's house, by being in it enough times that it became a part of you. Mr. Archibald ran the store 2 blocks from where I grew up. I could not tell you what his first name was because to every child on that street he was simply Mr. Archibald, and that was his full name as far as we were concerned. He had been in that store since before my mother was born. He sold cornmeal in the big paper sacks, the ones that left a fine white dust on your hands. He sold fatback and salt pork laid out on butcher paper. He sold canned goods, butter beans, hominy, field peas, and he stacked them in a pyramid near the window because he had an eye for arrangement even if the store itself was modest. He kept a jar of peppermint sticks on the counter, and if you came in with your grandmother on a Saturday morning, he would give you one without being asked and without being paid, because that is what you did. But here's the thing I want you to understand about Mr. Archibald's store. Here's the thing that took me years of living to fully comprehend. That store was the bank, that store was the safety net. When the week ran short, and the week ran short more often than not in those years, you did not go hungry because Mr. Archibald kept a little notepad behind the counter, a spiral notepad with a red cover, and he wrote your name and what you owed, and you paid him when you could. No interest, no penalty, no embarrassment, just your name in that red notepad and the understanding between neighbors that you would make it right. My mother told me once that she went into that store in the winter of 1952 with exactly 47 cents, and she needed to feed 5 children. Mr. Archibald sold her a pound of neck bones for 15 cents, a bag of dried butter beans for a dime, and a half loaf of bread for a nickel, and he told her to keep the rest. She came home and she made a pot of something that simmered on the back of the stove from 9 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon, and by the time that pot was ready, the whole house smelled like warmth itself, like something was going right even when everything was going wrong. That is what I mean when I say those stores were different. They were not just commerce, they were community infrastructure. They were the quiet architecture of survival. Now let me walk you down the street a little further, because Mr. Archibald's store was not the only one. On a healthy black business block in the 40s and 50s and into the 60s, before urban renewal came through like a slow bulldozer and took what it took, You could find almost everything you needed within 3 or 4 blocks and give all of your money to your own people. Think about what that meant. Think about what it meant to walk into a barber shop and the man cutting your hair owned the chair, owned the building if he was lucky enough, owned every bottle of Pinot Clubman on that shelf. Think about what it meant to sit in that chair, not as a transaction, but as a neighbor. The barbershop deserves its own moment. I know the barbershop is usually spoken of as a man's place, and it was in the way that things were divided then, but even as a girl, I knew the barbershop. My father went every other Saturday without exception. He came home smelling like talcum powder and bay rum, and there was something different about him when he came back. Something settled. He had been somewhere that was his. He had talked to men who looked like him about things that mattered to them, the game, the news, the slow insults of the daily world, and the plans to do better. The barber shop was the place where dignity got recalibrated, where a man who had spent the week being called by his first name, by people who expected to be called Mister in return, could walk in and be addressed correctly, treated like the full human being he was. Mr. Calvin's barber shop had 4 chairs. On a Saturday, it had 4 barbers. The wait could be 2 hours long, but nobody left because nobody wanted to leave. There was a radio, there was conversation. There were magazines, Jet, Ebony, the Pittsburgh Courier folded and refolded until it was soft as cloth, and there was the smell, that specific barbershop smell of hair tonic and hot combs and something faintly antiseptic that meant cleanliness and care. My father paid 65 cents for a haircut in 1955. By 1962, it was 80 cents. He never complained once. Now, on the same block as the barber shop, or maybe around the corner, there was almost always a beauty shop. And if the barber shop was the place where men recalibrated their dignity, the beauty shop was the place where women reclaimed themselves entirely. Miss Rosetta ran hers out of her front 2 rooms. Front parlor became waiting area. Back parlor became the shop, and she did not stop working until every woman who walked in that door walked out looking like she was going somewhere important. Because she understood that looking like you were going somewhere important was sometimes the only power you had. Looking like you deserved respect was a form of insisting upon it. Miss Rosetta's had the hot comb. It had the pressing oil. It had the distinct smell of hair being pressed, and the sizzle of the comb being laid against the stove's eye to get the temperature right. She knew every temperature by sight and sound. She could tell if a comb was too hot by holding it an inch from her cheek. She knew every woman's hair the way a doctor knows a patient. The texture, the thickness, the history. My grandmother sat in that chair every 2 weeks, and she came out of there a different woman in the best possible way. Taller, steadier, ready. Between the grocery and the barber shop and the beauty shop, there was usually a cafe. Not always, not on every block, but often enough. A small one, sometimes no more than 8 or 10 tables covered in oilcloth, with a counter along one wall and 4 or 5 stools bolted to the floor. The kind of place where the menu was on a chalkboard and the chalkboard had not changed significantly in a decade because the food was good and changing it would have been an insult to everyone involved. Miss Vera's Cafe on our block opened at 5:30 in the morning 6 days a week, closed Sundays after the lunch rush. She made biscuits from scratch every single morning, and she made them in a cast iron skillet that was older than she was. She had learned to make those biscuits from her mother, who had learned from her mother, and so on, back through a line of women whose names I do not know but whose hands I can almost see. White flour, lard, real lard, not shortening, buttermilk, a little baking powder, a little salt, worked by hand until just combined and no further, because overworking a biscuit is the one sin in biscuit theology. She cut them with the rim of a water glass, not a biscuit cutter. She brushed the tops with butter right out of the oven. You could smell those biscuits a half block away when the wind was right. For 15 cents, you got 2 biscuits and a cup of coffee. For a quarter, you got eggs. For 35 cents on a Friday morning, she would put a piece of fried salt fish on your plate alongside. And that was a luxury. That was a celebration. That was the kind of thing that made a hard week feel manageable before it had even fully started. And here's the thing, here's what I want you to really sit with. Every single person who walked through Miss Vera's door was known. Every single one. She knew who was working the early shift and who had just come off the night. She knew who was having trouble at home without being told. She knew who needed an extra biscuit slipped onto their plate without comment. This is the thing that no chain restaurant on earth can replicate, not for any price. The knowledge, the care embedded in the knowledge, the way being seen by someone who looks like you and comes from where you come from, is its own form of nourishment. I want to talk now about the fish market, because the fish market is something that almost nobody documents, and almost everybody who is old enough to remember it carries with them like a specific sensory memory that sits behind the eyes. Ours was called just that, the fish market. No fancy name. A man named Brother Tate ran it, though I'm not sure if brother was his given name or a title of affection that had simply stuck until it became the same thing. He had been selling fish since before the war, the Second War, and he sold everything that came out of the water in any form it came in. Whole catfish packed in ice, whiting by the pound, mullet in summer, crab in season, shrimp when he could get it, oysters when the world cooperated. The floor of that fish market was concrete, always damp, always cold. It smelled the way it was supposed to smell, of brine and cold, and the specific mineral cleanness of things that live in water. It was not a smell that apologized for itself. It was the smell of real food honestly sold. He would clean your fish while you waited, talking to you about everything and nothing, his hands moving with a speed and precision that came from having done the same motion 10,000 times. He wrapped your purchase in newspaper, sheets of the local paper folded tight and sealed with a little tape, and you carried it home in a brown paper bag, and by the time you walked through your front door, the newsprint was slightly damp and smelled of both the water and the ink, and that combination is something I have never been able to adequately describe to anyone who did not already know exactly what I mean. Friday was fish day. This was not negotiable. This was not a suggestion. Friday was fish day across the neighborhood the way Sunday was church day, with the same kind of communal agreement that did not require discussion. You fried your fish on Friday in a cast iron pan, in lard or in Crisco, in a cornmeal coating seasoned with salt and pepper, and sometimes a little garlic powder, and the smell of fish frying went from house to house on that block like a conversation. You could smell your neighbor's fish and they could smell yours, and nobody minded. It was a collective act, a shared sacrament. Now I have to talk about what happened to these blocks and these streets. I have to, because telling you about the stores without telling you what took them is not the full truth, and you deserve the full truth. What happened was not one single thing. It was several things arriving close together, overlapping, and the combination was more than most of those blocks could withstand. First, there was the highway. In city after city in the 40s and into the 50s and 60s, highways were laid right through the middle of black neighborhoods. This was not an accident, and it was not geography. It was policy. Planners looked at a thriving block, a block with Mr. Archibald's store and Miss Vera's cafe and Mr. Calvin's barber shop, and the highway went through that block. The buildings came down, the people moved, and what the highway did not take, urban renewal took. The phrase urban renewal entered the language as a promise and operated as an erasure. Neighborhoods that had been called blighted because they were poor and black were cleared and redeveloped, and the residents who had built those communities, the ones who held those red notebooks with your name in them, and who knew how you liked your hair and who slipped you an extra biscuit without being asked, those people were scattered. And then the second thing happened, integration. And I want to say this carefully because integration was righteous and necessary, and we marched and bled for it, and I would not have it undone. But integration had a side effect that nobody talked about in the celebrations. When the doors of white-owned stores opened to us legally, some of us walked through them, and we spent our money there, and the black-owned store on the corner lost customers it could not afford to lose. The economy of the black neighborhood had been built in part on exclusion. A terrible foundation, yes, but it had created something real, and when the exclusion ended, some of what it had built began to dissolve. I'm not assigning blame, I'm describing what happened. The way you describe weather, not because weather is anyone's fault, but because understanding what fell on you helps you understand why you're wet. The third thing was time itself. Mr. Archibald aged, his children had gone to college, which was the dream, which was the point of all that work, and they did not come back to run a corner store. Miss Rosetta's hands eventually would not hold the hot comb the way they used to. Brother Tate's knees gave out on him sometime around 1973, and there was no one waiting to take his place at that cold concrete counter. When these people left, They did not just leave. They took with them the knowledge and the relationships and the 30 years of trust built between neighbors. You cannot buy that. You cannot build it back quickly. It is the work of a generation. I want to tell you about one more place before I start to bring us to the other side of this, because I have been carrying it with me this whole time, and it is the place I think about most. It was not a store exactly. It was a pharmacy, but calling it a pharmacy undersells it the way calling the church just a building undersells what the church was. It was Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont's pharmacy, and it had a soda fountain, a genuine soda fountain with chrome taps and round stools and a mirror behind the counter so you could see yourself sitting there, which, when you're 8 years old and the world has a habit of making you feel invisible, is its own quiet gift. Mr. Beaumont had a pharmacy degree from a black college, and the getting of that degree had been a story in itself, a story of sacrifice and determination that I only understood fully as an adult. He wore a white coat, he filled your prescriptions, he knew which medications your grandfather was on, and he would call you at home if there was something about the dosage that concerned him, because he felt responsible, not legally responsible. Actually responsible, the way a neighbor is responsible for a neighbor. Mrs. Beaumont ran the soda fountain side. She made limeades and cherry cokes and milkshakes, and on Saturday afternoons the stools were full of children, and the conversation was full of noise, and it was one of the genuinely happy places I have ever been. The milkshake cost a dime in the early years. A dime. And she put enough ice cream in it that you could not drink it through the straw without effort. And she brought you a long spoon without being asked, and she called you baby whether you were 8 or 80. That pharmacy closed in 1968. The building was eventually torn down. There is a parking structure there now. I have driven past it, and it is the most ordinary thing in the world, gray concrete, nothing. And I always have to remind myself that what was there before was not ordinary at all. So where does this leave us? What do we do with all of this? I have been sitting across this table from you for the better part of this conversation, and I want to be honest with you now the way I always try to be honest with you, without sentimentality and without despair, because neither one is useful to us. What we had on those streets was not perfect. The people who ran those stores worked themselves to exhaustion and died tired. The beauty of what they built existed in conditions no one should have had to endure. The exclusion, the underfunding, the quiet violence of a society that told them their neighborhoods were less than and then proved it with policy. I do not romanticize the poverty. I do not pretend the neck bones and the 47 cents was a charming rustic detail rather than the edge of a cliff people were trying not to fall over. But I also hold on to what was real. The red notebook, the biscuits, the fish on Friday, the man who knew your grandmother's name without being told, the woman whose hands knew your hair better than you did, the pharmacist who called you at home because he felt responsible. These were not small things dressed up as big things. These were big things, actual big things that happened to live in small buildings on modest streets and neighborhoods that history has largely declined to remember. And here's what I know. The memory is not nothing. The memory, when you speak it out loud to someone else who was there, does something. It says that these people existed. It says that this life was lived. It says that what was built in those conditions with those resources against those odds was worth building, worth remembering, worth honoring. And that the wisdom in it, the understanding that commerce and community are not two separate things, that a store is a relationship and a neighborhood is an agreement between its people, that wisdom is not outdated, that wisdom is precisely what we are still searching for. I think about the young people sometimes, the ones who are trying to build something now, who are opening Black-owned businesses in a world that has different challenges, but some of the same fundamental questions. And I want them to know that what they are doing has roots, that every time someone opens a shop and decides to know their customers by name, every time someone extends credit to a neighbor, every time someone puts an extra biscuit on a plate without being asked, they are continuing something. They are not starting from nothing. They are reaching back into a tradition that is older than any of us and deeper than most of us know, a tradition that survived things that should have ended it multiple times over. My grandmother used to say that nothing good is ever really lost. It just waits for someone to remember it well enough to bring it back. I used to think that was just a thing grandmothers say, a comfort offered in the way grandmothers offer comfort with kindness and imprecision. But I am a grandmother now myself, and I have lived long enough to understand what she meant. The memory is the seed, speaking it out loud is the planting. And who does the growing? Well, that is not ours to control, ours is only the telling. So today I told it, and if you were there, if you remember that screen door, that smell of brine and newsprint, that particular click of a hot comb being set down on the edge of the stove, then you know I told it true, and your knowing matters. Your remembering matters, you are the record. Don't let it go quiet in you. Speak it, write it, tell it to whoever will sit still long enough to listen. The streets may be gone, but you are still here. And for right now, so am I.